in his hand. And as best I can tell, it worked. I don't think any other classes did it after that. Well, what does it mean to graduate? Is that the end? It's a rite of passage. It marks the end of something, but also the beginning of something new. We congratulate people because they made it. We all know that not everyone who starts finishes. In fact, if you've been around a few years, you may remember what it used to be like for medical school students on their first day of medical school. It sounded something like this. Look at the person on your left. Now look at the person on your right. Two of you are not going to make it through medical school. Not all who start finish. I know about this. I have 3 degrees, an undergraduate degree, a master's degree in education, and my Master of Divinity from the seminary. But I still live this idea of finishing on a daily basis. Let me give you an example. I work out at CrossFit, and one of the things about CrossFit is that you're not done until everybody is done. In other words, if you finish early, you cheer on whoever is still going. Everybody there knows my name. Because I'm almost always dead last. Come on, Drew, you can do it. I'm last, but I finish. Well, this morning, I want to take some time to consider the fact that God certainly congratulates us for making it this far in life, but we know we are not done, and we are expected to continue this race. If we are still breathing, then God is not done with us, and God expects us to continue to grow. There is not one place in the Bible where God comes to someone and says, I just want you to keep doing what you're doing and just stay the same. In effect, we find ourselves in a commencement this morning. We've made it to a certain point in our lives, but the learning process is not over, and the focus of our lives needs to be moving forward on the future and not the past. As Christians, we want to be better prepared for life. As soon as we stop growing and learning, we start dying. So we find ourselves in life having succeeded or failed or just having a bad day. We find ourselves at the end of the chapter, but it's not the end of the book as far as our growth as Christians go. You've heard the name George Bernard Shaw. Here's a quote of his. He said, "Most people die at 30 and are buried at 60. How sad is that? Is that what we're doing? Are we just trying to find a comfortable way to die? Let me tell you what the approach of our church is. Our church is one of education and growth, not indoctrination and being right. Our church is a place to come to worship, to learn, and to grow, not to come to be told how to be right. There's a difference between being right and lifelong learning. Our relationship with the living Christ does not stop along the way because we have it all figured out. It is either growing or it is not. The worst possible thing that we could teach to our recent graduates or to each other is that the race is over. Think about it this way. We believe in good doctors, don't we? Do you want your physician to stop learning in today's world? What makes us as Christians any different than that? In this New Testament passage that we read, the prodigal son had a lot of faults, but at least he kept moving. He was the typical young graduate, big dreams. He had a little stock, so he decided to cash it in. And he decided if he could just get free and do his own thing, man, life would be so much better. He did have the courage to act, but he did it in a way that he would come to regret, and it was painful. He, in effect, comes to his father and says, you know, I wish it was the day after your funeral so that I could take what is mine and do what I want. And we already come to a very important lesson in this story. We had better be careful what we ask God for, because very often he will let us have it. So the prodigal son gets what he wants, steps out on his own. There's a whole lot of parents that wish their grown kids would at least do just that this day, just go on. One of my favorite videos on America's Funniest Videos is this dad who's so tired of seeing his son play video games. He calls his son outside, and the dad has all his video games lined up in front of a riding lawnmower. And the son is screaming, "No!" And the dad says, "I told you to get a job," and plows over all the video games. Well, the prodigal at least acted on what he saw as an adventure. The distant country, the far country, gave him the opportunity to do things his way. But it was very different than what he expected. And he learns what all of us have learned to some degree. We live in a world that we did not create, and we don't get to make the rules of how life works. And God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. So the prodigal son spends all of his inheritance, which coincided with all of his so-called friends ditching him as soon as the money was gone. And he clearly had no job skills whatsoever, so he finds himself doing the lowest job a Jewish person could do, feeding pigs. And I think we might describe this as a collision of realities. We've all been at these points where we're forced to ask those hard questions. What do I do with the rest of my life? Where do I go from here? This was a crossroads that all of us face at one time or another. And here's our choices. We can give up and give in to defeat, commit suicide, or do what so many people do, just die slowly. Or we challenge ourselves to grow. And we move into our future with less fantasy and more reality. A psychologist might say it this way: we either take the road of self-despising or the way of self-love. Does anybody watch this show that has all these reruns called Intervention? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? I'm watching one this past week I thought I had seen before, but then something happens that I must have missed the last time. This guy is an alcoholic and has a circle of good old boys around him, and they were interviewing his friends about him, literally in front of him, and this good old boy surprised me with some incredible insight. He looked at his alcoholic friend and said, "I have never seen someone who hated himself so much." Let's give the prodigal son credit. At his lowest, he did not give up on his future. The Bible describes it in a really interesting way. It says he came to himself. Isn't that an interesting choice of words? He came to himself. And then he reached out for help. And we all know that is not easy. He set out on a journey back home, but not just physically. He clearly set out on an inward journey as well. He realized this was not something he could do on his own, and he recognized that he still needed his father. The man that he had told that my money that I'm getting is more important than you. It's critical that we note that had it not been for the father, the son would not have made it through this critical stage of his life. At first, he thought way too much of himself. Then he comes back and thinks way too little. And in his speech that he was preparing for his dad, he in effect says, "I just want to be treated how I feel about myself," the lowest of the low. But before he can even get into the second sentence of this speech that he must have repeated in his head hundreds of times, the father sees him, runs out, embraces him completely. He refuses to hear any talk that would point to anything less than him still becoming everything that God intended him to be. Give him the ring. give him the robe, give him the shoes. Those were all symbols of having responsibility. And this is Jesus' way of teaching the lesson that we don't get to be infants psychologically or spiritually. We have to keep on learning. We have to keep on growing. Had the prodigal never returned, it would have never happened. Had he refused to ask for help, it would have never happened. Had he ultimately not been open to growth in his life, this would not have happened. And there is not a person listening this morning that is any different. We either keep learning and growing, or we start dying. We recognize that we are in a world that we did not create, and that we don't get to make the rules of how life works, and that we are in need of help from another. And God will allow us to learn on our own what we refuse to be taught. And we are learning that as a nation in a most painful way. America is having a bad day. Had the nightmare in Texas not happened this week, the headlines in the news would be the story of the Southern Baptist Convention not only stonewalling victims of abuse, but they literally kept a secret database of abusers. Secret. Because they were afraid that the money would not keep rolling in if they told the truth. What do these stories have in common? People in positions of authority who are more interested in their own power than the most vulnerable among them. Before I share the quote I want to read to you this morning, I need to clarify a couple things. First of all, our church has no affiliation with the Southern Baptist Convention. We never officially cut ties. But when they no longer supported ordained women in ministry like Naomi, they left us. Secondly, this quote is from an article in The Atlantic that was written in response to the apocalyptic report that an independent agency did on the Southern Baptist Convention. And it sadly rings true for both that story and the tragic shooting in Texas. This is the quote. The responsibility does not rest with Baptists alone. Christians have created a culture that all too often celebrates male power at the expense of female dignity. Our churches frequently follow charismatic leaders even when they wave red flags in our face. And when other churches fail and other leaders fall, we shake our heads and say, thank God we're not like them. Reform isn't just a matter of prudence. Christians believe in a God who burns with anger when his people abuse and neglect the most vulnerable among us. Jesus once said it would be better for a millstone to be tied around a man's neck and for him to be thrown into the sea than for him to cause a child to stumble. The Bible does not teach figure out a way to keep change from happening at the expense of the most vulnerable. What do we see Jesus doing with the disciples over and over again? Continuing to teach, seeing all of life as a process of growth, continuing to grow in our relationships with him, with each other, and with God. That kind of example is the best preparation for life that I know, and it has never been more important in our lifetimes. As we end this morning, I want to share with you one of the most meaningful things I do as a pastor, and where I have seen some of the greatest evidence of Christian growth. It's when I have the privilege of walking down that last road with someone and watching them negotiate their last challenge, what their death is going to look like. Let me tell you what that looks like for someone who has been on a lifelong adventure with the risen Christ. They know where they're going. They come to a sense of peace. They know that this is the end of the chapter, but it is not the end of the book. And they want to model that for their family. And they leave the world better than they found it. Are we going to leave this world a mess for our children to clean up? Or are we going to accept our God-given challenge to grow? Dear God, give us the courage to do more and to do better and to grow and to protect the least of those among us and give them peace. Amen. We've given many invitations in our church over the years. In the last few months, our staff just decided maybe we just need to give people an invitation to be a part of the kindness and not a part of the ugliness. Tomorrow is Memorial Day. It's in honor of people who have given the ultimate sacrifice for our freedoms. And if you have someone in your family that has given that sacrifice, make sure your family knows that story. My grandfather died at age 38. He didn't die during the war, but he died at age 38 from complications of being gassed in World War I. I can't imagine what that must have been like. My girls need to know that story. Your family needs to know yours. Our hymn is number 686, "O God, our help in ages past." What a perfect hymn to sing at a time like this. Will you stand? Will you sing? Will you respond? We remain standing for just a moment. It has been such a good day. So glad to have each and every one of you here. So glad to be able to connect with you for those of you that are home. This June, we're going to do something fun. Each Wednesday, we're going to meet at 5:30 for a meal together, And then we're going to do a book study. This is Mitch Albom's latest book, The Stranger in the Lifeboat. It is conducive to some really good discussion, and your homework for this week is the first 3 chapters. So I'll see you on Wednesday at 5:30. We'll have a meal, and then we'll talk about this book. It is just a great time to be a part of our church family. We're so blessed in so many ways, and I'm so glad that each and every one of you are a part of it. Will you join with me now in our open-eyed benediction? When you go out into the world, take God's peace with you. The world needs it. Be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Never return evil for evil. Support the weak. Help the afflicted. Love all people and rejoice in the power of the Spirit. And may the blessings of God the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit go with you now and remain with you forever.